They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, ordinary people. But when the call for freedom rang out, they stood against the greatest empire the world had ever seen. From the blood-soaked hills of Bunker Hill, to the decisive forests of Saratoga, and finally, the muddy fields of New Orleans. These were the battles that forged a nation. If you've ever wondered how the United States earned its independence, not just on paper but with sweat, sacrifice, and strategy, this is the story. Welcome to PHT Eternal Mysteries, where the echoes of history come to life. During the American Revolutionary War, the United States Army, formed from citizens across all levels of colonial society, had to face off against the most powerful military force in the world at the time, the British Imperial Army. And yet, through a series of critical and hard-fought battles, the Americans eventually forced Britain to sit down at the negotiating table and recognize the independence of the United States. What were those key battles? And what miraculous elements led to these victories? Everything will be revealed in this episode of World History. The Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. The context. Leading up to the battle. In 1775, tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown had reached a boiling point. The British no longer trusted local militias and attempted to confiscate their weapons. In response, colonial militias in Massachusetts rose up and fired back at British soldiers. Soon after, George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The Battle of Bunker Hill became one of the first major military engagements between the two sides. Although it's named after Bunker Hill, most of the fighting actually took place on Breed's Hill, near Charlestown, Massachusetts, not far from Boston. This occurred during the Siege of Boston, marking the early phase of the Revolutionary War, which would last from 1775 to 1783. Strategic importance. American intelligence revealed that the British were planning to seize control of Boston and its crucial seaport, which allowed British warships to bring in reinforcements and supplies. To gain the upper hand, the British aimed to take Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, which offered elevated positions over the harbor. The American militias, however, stood their ground, determined to protect these vital positions. The forces on each side. The British Army, commanded by General William Howe, consisted of 2,400 troops, fully equipped and supported by naval artillery from nearby warships. The American side had about 1,500 militia fighters, led by Colonel William Prescott and General Israel Putnam. On the night of June 16, 1775, American forces hurried to build fortifications on Breed's Hill. By morning, their defenses were in place. A British lookout aboard the warship HMS Lively spotted the American presence and quickly opened fire. Although this was intended to halt a possible flanking attack, very few British troops were mobilized in time to secure forward positions. British strategy and movement. Under Howe's command, the British moved from the other side of the peninsula to the southern shore, preparing their light infantry for a direct assault on the American positions. Rather than attempt to flank the Americans, the British seemed to either underestimate colonial resistance or overestimate their own military strength. How the battle unfolded. British forces advanced in tight, disciplined formations, wearing bright red coats, bearskin or tricorn hats, and carrying bayonets and muskets. They also had light cannons and naval support. In contrast, the Continental Army was poorly equipped, low on ammunition, and armed with whatever firearms they could find. Still, they stood ready with muskets, some light weapons, and sheer determination. Early in the morning, the British launched 3 waves of frontal assaults on the American redoubt atop Breed's Hill. Despite their superior numbers and firepower, the British troops were cut down in droves by well-prepared American defenders. Colonel Prescott famously instructed his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," a strategy to conserve their precious ammunition. Outcome of the battle. Eventually, the Americans ran out of ammunition, and were forced to retreat in an orderly manner. The British took the hill, technically a tactical victory, but suffered devastating losses. Casualties: British, 1,150 killed or wounded. Americans, 450 killed or wounded. Why it mattered. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a turning point in morale. It proved that American colonists could stand toe-to-toe with the British regulars. It marked the end of the political phase of the Revolution and the beginning of full-scale warfare. It also signaled a final rejection of Parliament's authority to govern the 13 colonies without representation. Commemoration. A monument was later built on the site to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the battle. A statue of Colonel William Prescott stands proudly, honoring his leadership and bravery. Today, Bunker Hill and its museum are preserved as part of the Boston National Historical Park, overseen by the U.S. National Park Service. The Battle of Saratoga, 1777. After the 7 Years' War in Europe, Great Britain emerged more powerful than ever. Yet, its colonial oppression in North America grew increasingly severe. The colonies, once loyal, now shifted from economic protest to armed resistance. The Continental Army was formed, and George Washington appointed as Commander-in-Chief. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence, marking the birth of the United States of America. But even before the ink dried, the Continental Army had already engaged British forces in several bloody skirmishes. The early years of the war were difficult. The British Empire, armed with the world's most powerful navy and a highly trained professional army, faced a rebel force that was poorly equipped, loosely organized, and constantly on the defensive. The British plan: crush the revolution. Fast. By the summer of 1777, the British devised a strategy for a swift, decisive victory. King George III ordered General John Burgoyne to lead 7,000 troops south from Canada, while General Howe would march north from New York City. Their goal? Cut off New England from the other colonies and crush the rebellion in its heartland. But Howe abandoned the plan and instead marched on Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne isolated. A struggle through the wilderness. Burgoyne's army faced harsh terrain, dense forests, and mountainous obstacles. Heavy cannons and supply wagons slowed the advance. Sparse settlements made resupply nearly impossible. Worse yet, American militias constantly ambushed the British, destroyed bridges, and blocked roads. By September 19th, Burgoyne reached Saratoga, New York, only to find 12,000 Continental soldiers and militia waiting for him. The first clash at Freeman's Farm. The first battle erupted at Freeman's Farm, where American marksmen, hidden behind trees and tall grass, rained musket fire on British lines. The British suffered heavy losses and were forced to hold their ground until reinforcements arrived. After 4 hours of brutal fighting, the Americans withdrew, but not before inflicting serious casualties. As October began, Burgoyne's army faced severe shortages of food and supplies. He knew he had to act quickly. October 7th. The final assault. On October 7th, Burgoyne launched a full-scale assault on the American positions. But General Horatio Gates and his men were ready. The Americans had already dug trenches, set up artillery, and prepared defensive lines. Each wave of British attack was repelled with fierce resistance. Heavy rain fell, and in that moment, the Continental Army launched a devastating counterattack, smashing through British lines. Burgoyne's forces, exhausted, starving, and outmaneuvered, fell back to their encampment near Freeman's Farm. The end of the line. Facing no escape, General Burgoyne called a council of war. They abandoned their cannons and wagons and tried to break through American lines at night with only minimal supplies. But the Americans had already surrounded them completely. With no options left, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17, 1777. The aftermath. The Battle of Saratoga became the turning point of the entire war. It proved to the world that the Americans could defeat a professional British army. It boosted morale and, more importantly, convinced France to join the war on the side of the Americans, changing the tide forever. The Battle of New Orleans, 1815. When the U.S. Congress, following the Senate and House, officially declared war on Great Britain on June 18, 1812, it was the first time in American history the young nation declared war on a foreign power. This marked the beginning of the War of 1812, driven by multiple causes: British trade restrictions during the war with France, the impressment of American sailors by the Royal Navy, and ongoing British insults to American sovereignty in international waters. But at its heart, it was a struggle for national honor and territorial ambition. And in 1815, the final and most dramatic battle unfolded. The setting: New Orleans, Louisiana. In the early morning of January 8, 1815, American General Andrew Jackson and his forces waited for the British to attack. To defend New Orleans, Jackson had established two defensive lines, one on each side of the Mississippi River. On the east bank, Jackson's line stretched across wide open fields along the Rodriguez Canal, about 1,000 yards long, flanked by the swamps of Chalmette. His army included regular U.S. Army troops, militia from Louisiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi, sailors, Marines, even privateers, led by pirate Jean Lafitte, and Choctaw warriors. On the west bank, General David Morgan commanded about 1,000 men, militia, sailors, and several cannons. The British offensive. The British command, under General Edward Pakenham, devised a two-pronged attack: a frontal assault on Jackson's main defenses with 2,100 troops, led by General Samuel Gibbs, a flanking maneuver on the west bank with 200 troops under General John Keane, supported by 700 additional men under Colonel Thornton, who were to cross the river and strike the Americans from behind. However, bad weather, lack of boats, and navigation delays disrupted their plans. The British launched the attack without full coordination, a decision that would prove catastrophic. The battle begins. At 5:00 a.m., the British launched their assault under the cover of fog. But as the mist lifted, they found themselves in full view of American artillery. General Gibbs's forces marched straight into withering cannon fire and musket volleys. Many British troops became trapped in the canal, unable to cross. Others stopped to return fire, but it was ineffective against the well-fortified Americans. Even worse, the flanking attack on the west bank was delayed and failed to provide relief. The bloodshed. The British suffered heavy losses. General Gibbs was fatally wounded. General Keane was also severely injured. General Pakenham, leading from the front, was mortally wounded on the battlefield. With their leadership broken, the British forces crumbled under American fire. General John Lambert, now in command, attempted a retreat and requested a temporary ceasefire to collect the dead and wounded. The result: British casualties, 285 dead, 165 wounded, and 484 captured or missing American losses. Just 13 dead and 30 wounded. It was a stunning victory for the United States. And yet, ironically, this battle took place after the war had officially ended. A peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, had been signed on December 24, 1814 in Belgium. But with no transatlantic communication, neither army had yet received the news. Why it still mattered. Despite coming after the peace agreement, the Battle of New Orleans had enormous symbolic value. It boosted national pride. It elevated Andrew Jackson to hero status, eventually becoming president. It forced Britain to fully honor the terms of the peace treaty. The battle marked the final chapter of British attempts to interfere in American affairs and solidified the United States' identity as an independent and sovereign power. From Bunker Hill to Saratoga to New Orleans, these were not just battles. They were turning points, moments when ordinary people stood against the greatest military power of their age and rewrote history. The Battle of Bunker Hill taught the world that America would not back down. The victory at Saratoga proved this rebellion had the power to endure. And the triumph at New Orleans reminded even the mighty British Empire that this young republic had come of age. These weren't just battles. They were statements of identity, engraved in the soil of a new world. So what legacy are we writing today? If Mesopotamia was the beginning of civilization, then perhaps America's revolution was the beginning of something even more radical. A government by the people, for the people. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this journey, because history isn't just behind us, it's within us.